All right, so my name is Chris McDonald. I'm the Vice President of the museum here. I want to thank you all for coming today on this beautiful February day where it's just too darn cold out to be outside, although it's plenty sunny. Cori's been talking with us. Him and Myrick are going to present here on the 172nd in the Philippines. The 172nd, of course, was the National Guard of the Vermont National Guard. We did not have an Air National Guard, so we didn't have Air and Army. It was just the National Guard was Army at that time in the 40s. The 172nd, of course, got mobilized in 1941, or very early 1941, and of course on December 7th, everybody got extended for the duration. They spent time training at Camp Landing and did also some maneuvers, the famous Louisiana maneuvers, and ultimately they went out to the Pacific in late 42, early 43. But they're going to talk about really the end of the war for the 172nd and talk about their time in the Philippines in 1945, which is just over, go ahead, hit that, just over 80 years ago today. So I think we've got about a 45-minute presentation. You got a lot of show and tell. I'll let you talk about that. Any rules you have for any of that, and then maybe 15 minutes of questions. We're open till 3 o'clock on program, but if people want to stay and it's area to look at things, we'll stay and keep the museum open. So I'll let Cori and Myron take it away here.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Take it away, Cori.
Thank you guys for coming. This is a fun little presentation. I have a couple confessions to make. The first one is I'm a transplant Vermonter. I came from across the Big Lake. I'm from Northern New York, so don't hate on me too hard. That being said, Myrick's from New Hampshire, so you can hate on that. This is, like Chris said, this is a presentation on the 172nd with its connection with Vermont, the Vermont National Guard. At that time, that was what they were known as. They were nationalized. We're going to kind of go through a little bit of the earlier portion of the war for them and some of their experiences and how it actually shaped their experience on Luzon. So it's a little more inclusive. I'll be honest, when I started talking with Chris, my initial thought was just specifically to do Luzon, but I found that they had such a cool history outside of actually their divisional history that it just kind of required just a little bit more in-depth study. So like Chris mentioned, their induction was on February of 1941. They were the National Guard unit for Vermont, 172nd. They had renumbered. They initially were called, and the history of the Vermont National Guard or Vermont Volunteers is long and storied. One of the reasons I nicknamed the talk Vermonters Ahead is because of their experience during the Civil War and how they actually had far out of proportion with how many soldiers they put in the field. They had an amazing career. Just real quick, the Infantry Regiment, 172nd was an infantry regiment at the time. You can quickly, if you want later, I'll pull up any one of the slides, or even if you want, I can send them to you. I don't care about keeping this information to myself. I prefer to just send it to everybody because I think it's really neat. But just to give you an idea, an infantry regiment at the time consisted of basically the rifle battalions, the infantry battalions, and there were 3 of those with a headquarters unit, and then they had some other attached units. One of the important things that during World War II, similar to what we have now with the combat brigades or brigade teams, was what they call a regimental combat team. And what that meant was that they discovered, after looking at a lot of different armies at the time, that the infantry regiments had a lot of firepower, but were somewhat undergunned in certain aspects. So what they would do is they would add organic firepower to the unit itself and use that infantry regiment as kind of the core for a larger unit. And that unit, with its organic firepower attached, could be, or attached firepower, I should say, could be used independently. So a lot of times I'll refer to the 43rd Infantry Division, which is their parent unit. But a lot of times you'll see that they actually operated independently, for better or for worse sometimes. So they could have attached engineering companies, medical companies, field artillery. You see also anti-aircraft, some other odd units, which I'll kind of touch on later on. And then a lot of times tank destroyers. And if you know anything about the war in the Pacific, that wasn't necessarily required. A lot of the firepower they carried in the infantry units were enough, especially later on in the war, to deal with any type of armor that the Japanese had. Everybody's seen photos like these of, the guys jumping with the tin helmets, the bolt action rifles. This is one of my favorites over here. If you look really carefully, it's a machine gun team, but if you look really carefully, it's wood. That'll come up. And then, the World War I style throwing of hand grenades, bayonet practice, and the classic Army loves. To give you a little background, I'm not military. I've been in law enforcement for more than a decade. So similar. I really loved the fact that the Vermont Police Academy had us do our beds time and time and time again. It really helps me on patrol. Yeah.
Those hospital corners, saved my life. I can't really comment.
So that being said, these things when you study World War II, if you look at any of the photos, especially early U.S. military photos for World War II, excuse me, a lot of this stuff you see and it kind of just rolls over you. What had occurred to me doing this is that this actually comes back to bite them right in the butt. So the Army at the time, if you know anything about interwar period, their funding was nil. They had very little funding. National Guard even less so. So when they were inducted, you're starting to see a lot of these trainings that were a little out of date, or they didn't have the right equipment to use. A lot of the image of the German Army training with wooden equipment wasn't necessarily because they didn't have the money, it was because they couldn't necessarily have it. The US military didn't necessarily have the money. So these machine gun teams couldn't be photographed having tanks and whatnot.
They couldn't be photographed.
So a lot of this stuff indicates that the training may have been substandard, okay? A lot of the stuff that they're training on wasn't necessarily based in the reality of what at the time was modern warfare, right? So kind of keep that in the front back of your mind. We'll use that term. The Louisiana maneuvers of 1941, which the 172nd took part in, that kind of came to the front. There were accounts, letters back from the soldiers to their families that said, yeah, we took part in the Louisiana maneuvers. You may have heard about them. We walked for 50 miles and then we're told, good job. So their training experience, again, not the highest. And a big part of that, and I give the military or the Army credit, they were going from, it was something in the field of the 17th smallest military 19th. To 19th. So we really were going from 0 to 100 in a very short amount of time. So they did try to rectify these problems, but it's something you're seeing.
Cori, would you like me to explain why?
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So prior to World War I, the National Guard structure was more or less a loose conglomeration of units in all the states. National Security Act of 1916 put them all under federal control, and they were activated for the border crisis in 1916, 1917, then activated for World War I. Some of them, the New Hampshire and Vermont units, actually were only back from the Mexican border for 2 weeks before they were activated for World War I. And so they put together National Guard divisions, sent them overseas to France. We won, spoiler alert. And get back, the Chief of Staff of the Army hated the National Guard with a passion. And instead of demobilizing them, which is the process of taking them from federal status back to state status, he discharged all of them, sent them all home. Discharge papers gone. So all of a sudden the state governors are like, we don't have a National Guard. We have the State Guard, who are the guys who can't get into the National Guard. They all have shotguns and trapdoor Springfields. So yeah, not going to disagree with that. The interwar years were a process of rebuilding, but it's also, we were very upset about what happened after World War I in Europe. We felt like we'd been betrayed, and we didn't want anything to do with another European war. So we were just going to shrink our army back to where it was, put them all on horses and send them back to the Southwest, like before World War I. Well, as things started getting hotter in Europe, there were some people in the government who had some foresight and thought, well, we need to do something about this. But then there were the ones who were like, and we're not going to get involved in another bloodbath, like the Great World War. Can't call it World War I yet. By the way, somebody once asked me, do you think there would have been a World War II without a World War I? And I said, yes, of course, because they're numerically consecutive. So, can't reverse it. So, the reason they are, my bad. The reason they are training with wooden machine guns, things like that, World War I equipment. In fact, the National Guard uniforms up until the late 1930s still included the riding breeches and either the canvas gaiters or puttees and the big campaign hat. The reason they're training with that stuff is because the military budget shrank so much after World War I, and they just didn't want to put anything else into it. Then you have the Great Depression where they can't really spend a lot of money on things like that. So when they started activating the National Guard units for training, they were issued as much World War I gear as they could get because that's all they had. In fact, when I enlisted in the Air National Guard in the 90s, most of the stuff I was issued was Vietnam era stuff. So it's a perpetual cycle in the military. Now, why? We didn't get involved in the war until December of 1941. Why would these maneuvers have been going on? Why were the National Guard units called up in 1941, in early 1941? Actually, they started calling up the National Guard units and instigating, there's my rebellious streak, instituting a draft in 1938 because Franklin Roosevelt saw what was going on and he convinced enough people that the European thing and the Asian thing is enough of a threat that we need to start building up our defenses. So they started activating National Guard units and they sent them to Hawaii because the Hawaiian Islands, we thought there was never a doubt that we were going to go to war with Japan. We didn't know when, and we didn't know how, but everybody knew. We, however, thought that they were going to send a fleet to the Hawaiian Islands and land a bunch of troops. You know, bomb the place to the ground and land a bunch of troops. So we prepared Oahu very well for that eventuality. That didn't happen. But what did happen was a lot of activated National Guard troops, like artillery units, were sent to the Hawaiian Islands to set up their batteries so that they could sink Japanese ships as they came. That's also the reason the maneuvers were taking place in Louisiana, because they wanted to get the troops acclimated to the heat and humidity. So all this is going along, this major buildup, call up of the National Guard was going on before we actually entered the war. So they are starting to replace some of the antiquated equipment. They're, in 1938, they adopt the M1 Garand, but it doesn't get into widespread service till late 42, early 43, somewhere around there. There's still, in mid to late 43, there are still US troops carrying World War I rifles. Not knocking it, they're great rifles. But it was kind of a backwards way of thinking. In fact, the dress uniform jackets that the enlisted men wore, the ones that were made in the late 1930s, had elastic in the back because they had a gusset, because they were expected to wear those coats into the field. The same thing with the World War I uniform. That's what they were thinking was going to happen with the early World War II uniform. That also didn't happen because it's a dumb idea. So when we look at this, it's not only like a nice snapshot into how kind of fun and goofy the training was. It's also kind of a warning that, you know, we should have been a little bit better prepared for this, but there was a lot of infighting going on. And incidentally, with these comforters here, you can't actually do a hospital corner, turns out. So all this, as Cori said, is going to come into play in the early stages of the war for this unit. Take it away.
So the 172nd forms up. They're at the point where they're about to be deployed. They made their way across the country to San Francisco. In October of 42, they left on the SS Coolidge, or USS Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, and which was a converted liner, which was a common thing. You hear that a lot in the cross-Atlantic aspect. They did the same thing. So at this point, the rest of the 43rd Infantry Division had already deployed. They had some adventures in the Pacific, but the 172nd, like I said before, was actually operating independently. So they left from San Francisco on their way to Espiritu Santo, where the Vermont problems with boats continues. There's a reason we're a mountain state. I say we because I feel strongly we are. Put us in boats, bad things happen. If you go back to World War I, the 95th Pioneer Infantry Regiment went across from the United States over to Europe at the end of the war in 1918, which helped bring Spanish flu, which helped bring influenza. And several hundred Vermonters were actually dead on the Leviathan, the ship that went across. So
Call it the Kansas flu.
we should call it the Kansas flu. I don't like Kansas, so.
Kansas Vermont flu.
But their string of good luck with boats continues, because as they entered the harbor at Espiritu Santo, they hit 2 friendly mines. Now you can small f friendly, and the ship started to sink in about 160 feet of water. This is directly offshore. The captain was smart and operated quickly. He brought it as close as possible. So you can see this is what's actually going on in this photo. It's a little bit of an optical, as my father would say, optical delusion. It's an optical illusion. They didn't just walk off the ship. They did have to swim in. But of the approximately 5,000 men on the ship from the 172nd Regimental Combat Team, only 2 of them were killed. And both of them were trying to help other men get out.
Could you let us see the picture?
Sorry, yeah.
So an interesting thing
I'm
about
short,
this
so that works.
You can see, because these ships normally would, dock at a dock and unload, they would have to get them off the ships through the cargo nets. So you can see most of these cargo nets go all the way down to the waterline. This one doesn't. This is for the tall guys.
I'll
And
tell you
of
what,
course, the average height was like 5'6", so there were no tall guys on the ship.
I take that. Oh, wait. Is this a clicker?
Does it work?
Does it work?
Does it work?
Nope. Volume went
It's
up
for the
though.
projector.
No, yeah, it's tied into the projector, not the,
Okay. Let me just move it over, and so I mess up everything. No.
So, Cori, how much noise did the Coolidge make when it sank?
I don't know. I feel like there's a joke in here.
It was silent.
Oh.
All right, we got some people. Yeah. The Calvin Coolidge, silent Calvin. I'm worried now because that's my e-material.
So you can see actually right up in here is actually where the Coolidge sank. So the shore is pretty close, but you can see the rescue efforts. Now that actually had kind of a, we'll call it backhanded positive. So all of that old equipment stayed on the Coolidge. So it's still there if you have the opportunity and want to go get some. It's still there. It's in 160 feet of water. And a lot of, and when I say a lot, I mean nearly all of their gear was lost. in several letters back, they actually thank the U.S. Navy Seabees that were on shore, because the Seabees are known for two things. One, being able to build anything they want, whether the Navy wants them to build it or not. And the second thing is being able to steal anything they want, whether it's nailed down or not, and they can get it unnailed and then steal it. So a lot of the guys in the 172nd received a lot of new gear because the Navy Seabees were able to find it for them. They reallocated a lot of things. That being said, it took them several months to actually get all of the equipment that they needed. But that's also one of the reasons that you see the next series of photos, a lot of their equipment is nearly brand new, which was kind of a mixed blessing for them.
So did they take the boat back off the beach just to keep it from being captured? Or?
It didn't actually get onto the beach. It's like I said, it's kind of an optical illusion. It's a lot closer than it's a lot further than it looks. It's an extremely large ship, but it was probably 300 feet offshore, and because of the reefs and everything, it was 160 feet deep. But because it took so long to sink, most of the guys, all but two, actually were able to get off safely. It's a great little cartoon about them never wanting to take a presidential liner again because of certain things that happened. So from there, fast forward, they were sent from Espiritu Santo. Once they got all their equipment, they were retrained. One of the big things that the 43rd Infantry Division was known for at the end of the war was its ability to assault beaches, so amphibious assaults. They were trained numerous times on amphibious assaults, which they did actually take part in multiple times. But once they were in theater at this point, they were going to be utilized for their first engagement, which is New Georgia. They took part in the landings. Again, they still hadn't hooked up with their parent unit. They were still operating independently. And even though they took part in amphibious landings in the campaign of New Georgia, they were actually, again, operating independently. They landed on a separate island. So they landed at the island of Rendova. And for nearly all of them, this was their first experience of combat, and it's jungle combat, amphibious combat. So this is pretty extreme for them. Their training you start to see their training break down relatively quickly. They did say that the 172nd, compared to some of the other their sister units that were in the 43rd, were doing well. They're just very hardy, and they did talk about several letters back home, and several commanding officers did write how the 172nd compared to the other two sister units were doing well, but they still were starting to show the cracks. You can see just a little bit of what the terrain is like. When you're trained in post-World War I combat, where you're talking about, ranges on your rifles, being able to, you're training on long ranges. You're training in the European style mentality of long range combat and everything. You are now looking at ranges of, less than 10 yards where you're engaging a concealed enemy.
And it's interesting that combat shotguns were used in the Pacific, but they were almost never used in combat in the European theater because they weren't of much use in Europe, aside from like guarding prisoners and things like that. But they were a great equalizer in the jungle. We should have brought one.
And just to give you an idea of what that toll takes, we'll talk about it in a second. Myrick's going to talk about it in a second. This is a member of the 172nd after 2 weeks in combat. And you can just see on his face the toll that this is taking. There's some severe issues that took place in the 43rd. And Myrick's going to talk about what were called war neuroses. This is Lloyd Culloch, 1st Battalion, 172nd. And you can see it. You can see it immediately. And what happened was what Myrick's going to talk about, but they started to suffer some severe losses. And it wasn't just physical. We start seeing what we would nowadays call PTSD, or combat fatigue is what they referred to, or war neuroses is the term that you hear. So whatever the term may be, you start seeing it. And there were numerous reasons for that, but I'll let Myrick kind of get into that a little bit.
So each war has its own different type of war neurosis. A lot of people confuse like shell shock, PTSD, combat fatigue. They're not the same thing. Recently, a lot of scientific studies have been looking at shell shock in the First World War and have determined that its cause is very different from what we see here. So we still use the term shell shocked for somebody like that because that is a great term for somebody who looks like this. But what we're seeing here is correctly what they said during, what they called it during World War II, combat fatigue. Normally when they would go into a combat situation, they would be given a set amount of days. 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, hard fighting, you'll be relieved. Never happened. What was the one? It wasn't Tarawa, was it? There was a battle in the Pacific where they were told it's going to be a walkover 1 day, and it lasted like weeks. That general got fired, but he was a Marine, so, too many crayons. So the issues that these troops face, for one thing, getting them acclimated to the climate in Louisiana was a good idea, but you can't copy the terrain of where they were at in the Pacific. The jungles were so thick that it would just close in over you. And anxiety basically boils down to a lack of control, fear of the unknown. So if you are used to, if you look back at the training pictures, they didn't even dig foxholes for the machine guns. They just put them down and look, there's a old truck with a sign on it that says tank. Have you seen the cartoon from 19?
Oh, yeah.
It's both. So there's a cartoon on YouTube that is both hilarious and disturbing at the same time that shows their training. And in the cartoon, they have these antique cars with signs on them that say tanks. My favorite one is the parachutist. Jumps out of the plane, pulls the ripcord, and the sign comes out that says parachute. But that was pretty accurate. So they're not trained when they get to, is New Georgia? Yeah, they're not trained when they get to New Georgia to dig in. They're told to, but they don't have the experience of knowing how to do it, how deep to go. They don't know how far apart to put their foxholes. They are sleeping, so they're told to sleep in their foxholes holding hands so that the other guy wouldn't disappear. It's like, that's terrible advice from the get-go. One person is awake, the other person is asleep. That's the way you do it. So, and then I don't know if they were specifically told it's going to be 3, 4, 5 days fighting, but these guys were in there for longer than most of the other units were. And so they saw record numbers of psychological casualties, which Cori has those numbers. And when you have the jungle closing in over you, you have sounds, things you've never experienced before. You can see under the bags under his eyes, clearly not getting sleep, clearly not getting bathed. And look how he's eating his food. He's just like ripping it apart. They're not getting good nutrition. If you're not getting sleep, you're not getting good chow, and you're not getting rest, then that it's a force multiplier for the enemy. So they're not used to being in this environment. Their leaders aren't the most competent, to say the least. There was a shakeup afterwards, which was good. They're not getting clean. They're not getting relief from their foxholes to go behind the lines. A lot of times, there was no real behind the lines for them to go. So that is a giant recipe for war neurosis, for combat fatigue. And like I said, they suffered it in record numbers. Normally, what they figured out during World War II was to treat war neurosis, you get them behind the line, you get them warm, well, cool if it's in the jungle, dry, fed, rested, and then you send them right back up. Because they found if they pulled them back and sent them to a rest area, it was harder to get them back into the line. Now, while that may save their life in the long run, that actually has more psychological damage than sending them back into combat. Because if you get pulled out of the line for psychological reasons, and they're not serious enough to get sent to, one of the psychiatric hospitals for a long-term stay, and you get pulled off the line, sent somewhere to rest and recuperate, you start to feel after a while like you couldn't cut it, you couldn't make it. And they found in studies with veterans from other wars and from early in World War II, if they did that, the people who they pulled from the lines had a much lower recovery rate from psychological disorders than the guys that got sent back up into the line. Because a lot of times, once you get them out of the line, get them fed, get them rested, get them cleaned up, and get them safe for a little bit, it is easier for them to go back into the line because now they know what to expect. They're back there on their bunks thinking, I could dig a little deeper. We could put the foxholes a little closer together or a little farther apart, and maybe, hear me out on this, not have both people sleeping in the foxhole at the same time. When you have that where they don't know what's going on, also, there aren't a lot of veterans around that they're able to talk to about, hey, what can we expect? So every noise you hear is a bonsai charge. I don't know if they were doing that at that point. Okay, every noise you hear is a bonsai charge. Every snap of a twig is an infiltrator. They had a lot of friendly fire incidents. They had battles between American units. And they said, we just, killed every Japanese soldier who came through here last night. And there'd be no Japanese soldiers. There'd be no Japanese ammunition on the ground, nothing. No footprints coming out of the jungle, just Americans shooting at each other. So that is a huge reason why this particular unit had such high psychological casualties. Just a combination of a whole bunch of things that the Army was in the process of figuring out and did actually get pretty good at figuring out. Do you have the numbers?
Yes.
Okay, he's gonna tell you the numbers. I'm not good with numbers, I was hired for my looks.
Yeah. And I was a history major, so I'm not great with numbers over 4 digits. It's a joke I use all the time and it never works, but never really lands.
I was a machine gunner, so I can only think in terms of 1,100.
There you go, yeah. So they took approximately 4,000 casualties on Munda, or on New Georgia, I would say. That's wounded, put back in the line and everything. Of those, 1,800 were war neuroses. It was the highest number that any unit in the U.S. military suffered for war neuroses, as they recorded it, through the war. It was the highest number, but it was the one incident that they pointed to. So there's numerous studies that were done. One of the big things that came out of that was that the divisional commander, it wasn't a direct correlation, but he was relieved. He was sent to do other things, and General Wing was put in. General Wing is actually a Vermonter. He was one of 3 or 4 U.S. divisional commanders that were National Guard generals that survived. I'll say survived their career in the war.
Which was pretty hard because the regular Army had no respect for the National Guard officers.
Right.
Even though a lot of the National Guard officers had more combat experience, not as a general rule, but a lot of the National Guard officers had a lot of combat experience from being activated for the border crisis and then World War I. And because they were able to stay in the National Guard when the military was being downsized, they were able to keep their training, not great training, but training nonetheless. Keep reading, keep studying, whereas the regular Army shrank. So when the war starts, you have a glut of new officers coming in. They weren't 90-day wonders at that point, I don't think. But you had new officers coming up, you had young Army officers, you had old regular Army officers, but then you had a cadre of National Guard officers who a lot of them had a lot of active duty experience actually in combat. So they came in and ended up doing a really good job and kind of earned the grudging respect of the active duty. To the point where in our chow hall, not the chow hall here, but the chow hall where I serve, there was a magazine cutout of, it was a picture of Dwight Eisenhower. It was taken after World War II, and it was a recruiting thing for National Guard and Air National Guard units, where Eisenhower is talking about the contribution of National Guard units and particularly the training of the men, because the National Guard troops tended to be older than their active duty counterparts. So they made such a great impression on the active duty commanders, the higher up ones, that the National Guard didn't get canceled after World War II. Bucking the trend.
One of the few glimmers that the 43rd experienced, and the 172nd specifically, was Lieutenant Scott. He eventually became captain, and I believe major, by the end of his career. But Lieutenant Scott, I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously, but he was awarded the Medal of Honor while holding a position single-handedly against what they believe was a company of Japanese soldiers. I'll absolutely pull this back up afterwards, but while he's not a Vermonter, he is 172nd, so we get dibs. But his action was shown he was extremely cool under fire, but he did show that there was not just a glimmer of professionalism and real grit in the unit, but what it's showing is that there's some serious quality of soldiers, despite all of the experiences that they were going through. So New Georgia, they finally took the island in February of '44. They left. They went to New Zealand for recreation. This was a big thing that the military wanted. New Zealand, they went to retrain recreation. A nice point is that the 43rd Infantry football team played the U.S. Marine Corps football team and trounced them 18-2, which was really embarrassing for the Marines because they lost 9-1 the day before. So it was another, I think it's the 37th Division, but another Army unit.
That would be hilarious.
So from there, the colonel or General Wing really starts his training regime, and he retrained them. He had some very positive, very influential ideas, different ideas on one of the things they experienced was difficulty in rooting out Japanese bunkers. So he instituted the newer techniques of destroying them, and we'll kind of talk about that when we go into Luzon itself. They started to utilize these techniques in New Guinea. At this point, the campaign in New Guinea in Aitape was actually winding down, but they still needed manpower, which is a consistent thing in the military. In December...
Could you touch on just a second as why they are going this way and the Marines are going this way?
So there were...
I know you know it.
There are actually two separate commands. And one of the things that they were trying to do was they had one main goal, but multiple different directions. But everything basically is pointing towards Japan. They're hopping islands, trying to go from island to island. We've long since passed the whole concept of defense only. Guadalcanal and things like that, holding small airfields. We are now in the process of hopping islands. One of the quick little anecdotes I use is that everybody's heard of Wake Island, which was actually one of the first times we successfully defended against the Japanese. Eventually we failed and they took the island. At this point, if you look very carefully, way up in the top, up in there, Wake Island is still technically Japanese held. It was one of the most highly defended pieces of property at the point. We didn't touch it. We actually used it as a training bombing run for our bomber pilots or bomber crews. And the whole point was that we cut them off on the vine, cut that fruit off on the vine. We don't need to take it. We don't need to expend forces and lives to take these places. So we're constantly moving up. And at this point, Australia and all of that is under command of an individual who I have opinions on. His name is General MacArthur. Everybody knows who he is. But he was incredibly, very brave. Yeah. So his goal eventually is to move up north from Australia, Papua New Guinea, through Indonesia, portions of Indonesia, through the Philippines. His goal is to retake the Philippines, famously. I'm not going to get into that. That's a pretty well-known fact. But militarily, it was a sound proposition.
Yeah, that really hurts my pride. Like, as much as I want to fault him, and as much of a stinker as he was kind of right about the Philippines.
So now we come to December 1944. The plan is to retake the Philippines. We've already begun Leyte, some other, Mindanao, other islands, but the main push is going to be on Luzon. So the main island of Luzon. And if you look, it's kind of right dead center of that map. And in late December 1944, the 172nd with its parent unit, get on their ships, and they're going to be utilizing the techniques that General Wing has trained them on. They're going to be using that amphibious training that they had also taken part in. They were one of the well-known units that took part in numerous amphibious trainings and operations by this point. And they had really been welded into a pretty solid unit.
It turns out it was easier to train certain high-speed units to be the spearhead for those operations than it was to train every unit to the same standard, which is why the Army designated units who were particularly good at what they did to be the spearhead.
So the units that you see here were part of the support, the artillery units and everything we had talked about before, and I'm going to kind of breeze through them real quick.
Although you do point out the uniforms in the bottom right picture.
You'll see the bottom right picture, and I can pull it up afterwards, but the uniforms, you're looking at pre-war or Louisiana maneuver uniforms that have the felt campaign cap, which is the World War I cap, basically.
The officers are wearing the breeches.
They're wearing the breeches, they're wearing the early pattern gear, they're wearing leather gear. By this point, really, the U.S. military had moved, most of their equipment had moved beyond that. They were utilizing heavy or 4.2-inch mortars to take part in the actual amphibious landing, because as part of it, you need your own artillery support. They weren't able to utilize the big heavy guns of the howitzers, which they normally would have been attached to, but what they did is they decided to attach mortar, heavy mortar, or what they call chemical mortar companies to them, batteries. And they were the equivalent of heavy 105 millimeter artillery batteries, but they just had shorter ranges and they were man-portable, theoretically. It's a very heavy gun, but the irony of these two photos on the left is that neither of those are actually their own mortars. Those are both captured mortars that they thought were kind of entertaining because they were a little crude by this point. The landing itself was actually taking place in the same place the Japanese had invaded Luzon at the beginning of World War II.
There's a great reason for that.
Lingayen Gulf, which is where they took place, the landings took place, is a fantastic place to assault. Very flat land. If you've ever seen pictures of any place in Normandy, but especially Omaha Beach, you can get multiple levels or layers of fire where they can the defenders can defend, multiple layers. They can see over the beaches. Lingayen Gulf is incredibly flat. A lot of this stuff was not necessarily rice fields, rice paddies, but it was very swampy. It was flat. It's extremely hard to defend. And the U.S. military's plan initially, when we were defending, was to defend it in depth, we'll call it. The Japanese did the same thing. They actually pulled a lot of their troops back, partly because they weren't 100% sure where the United States was going to land, but also partly because it's an incredibly difficult place to defend. So what they did defend it with was just defense with fire. So they left a lot of their artillery, which was north of the landing beaches, which we'll get into, but they left most of their artillery batteries in place, heavy batteries, and they were the ones that were covering the beaches. So January 9th, early in the morning, after several days of artillery from the ships, they took part in the landings. Kind of an interesting aspect is that the 1st Battalion, 172nd, were considered more, at this point, more populated by Vermonters. At this point, if you look at the numbers, they had a higher proportion of Vermonters, and that battalion was actually going to be the assault battalion. And they were the furthest left flank unit of the invasion army. So their goal was not just to take on the invasion beaches head on, but was to actually cover that left flank. The landings themselves were very effective. The 172nd troops wrote that they didn't see anybody other than some locals, but the reality was that the Japanese had pulled back because, like we had said, there were some issues in defending that.
You can see in the big photo on the right, to give you an idea, at Normandy, mile per mile, each of the landing beaches had the same amount of German defenses. The reason the casualties were so much higher on Omaha was because the Germans were up on cliffs and could shoot down. If you look at this picture here, there's virtually no elevation there. So all you can do is dig into the ground, the sand, which, you know, a couple explosions will move the sand in on top of you. And you don't have a force multiplying wall of rock to keep the attacking troops away. So if they get enough ashore, they're just going to overrun you. So that is part of the reason the Japanese pulled back from that, because that is by no means a defensible beach, which is why everybody lands there when they want to invade. And now we know.
So on S-Day, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition between D-Day, which everybody knows, one of the more important amphibious assaults that we took part in. On D-Day, for comparison, infantry units, there are approximately 57,000. 57,500 is about the number that they usually refer to for U.S. troops on D-Day. By comparison, S-Day landing on Luzon had about 68,000. So there are actually more U.S. troops that landed, combat troops that landed on the first day at Luzon than on Normandy.
And that's because of MacArthur's constant whining. One of the things he did well was when he had enough, he kept pushing. And to get him off his commander's back, they just gave to him and gave to him and gave to him. And it was actually, I gotta say, it was actually a pretty brilliant strategy. He knew what he was doing. So he was able to bring superior forces to bear because he had more guys than he was supposed to.
I've always liked this photo. This is S plus 2 minutes. This was taken. So this is not the exact unit that we're talking about, but this was 2 minutes after the invasion took place. So they're already on shore, but it's very, very short time. So you can see again, very flat, very wet. A lot of the area was very swampy, mangrove type forests. They landed in the San Fabian area, and it was palm groves. From there, most people when you talk about the invasion of Luzon, they talk about the race to Manila and then the Battle of Manila. Very important for the war and whatnot because it was an important area. The 172nd didn't take part in that. They were on that left flank. They were taking part in that blocking force. There were approximately 60,000 Japanese troops north of that race to Manila. So, of course, the military wanted to stop those troops from, attacking that flank. So they pushed the 43rd. That was really the left-hand division. They pushed that 43rd into what's called the area which is called the De Mortis and Rosario Road district. It's the Zambales, I probably butchered that name, but Zambales mountain range. So when you look at a lot of the images of Manila, of Luzon, a lot of it's pretty flat. You get a lot of flatlands, a lot of scrub brush and things like that. If you're looking here, it's very mountainous. So the northern portion of Luzon is actually extremely mountainous. And if you look carefully, you can see that these defensive positions were extremely well positioned. The one thing the Japanese were really good at is defensive positions. In this area, there were positions such as what's called Hill 900, which just indicated where it was and the elevation and whatnot. When the Americans took it on January 28th, so it took them several weeks, when the 172nd took Hill 900, which was an artillery position, they actually found underground concrete bunkers that were stables for horses, for field artillery. because they were horse-drawn artillery. And they were finding horses still there and extremely well supplied. And they just noted how incredibly, heavily defended these positions were for their horses. There was an incident where they ambushed a whole artillery battery that was in a valley, and they were able to wipe out the entire battery. But at the very last minute, the Japanese were able to get off a few shots and were able to take out a few Americans. But it just showed like the amount of artillery that the Japanese had. On January 30th, great little incident. Because of the amount of artillery, we needed counter battery fire. And there was a 155 millimeter howitzer somewhere in the area of these mountains. And just looking at the area, that's a really tough thing to find, especially when it's hidden or it's in a concrete bunker. And there was an 81 millimeter mortar section that honed in on it. And they decided to have a duel over the course of an afternoon. So you have this 81 millimeter mortar team just throwing rounds in this area and against this massive artillery piece. And they won. They were able to destroy the battery. They knocked out 2 guns and killed most of the crew, which again shows the professionalism of these troops. It also kind of goes back to what happened on Munda, or on New Georgia, where at night they were both sleeping in their foxholes. On the night of February 2nd, 3rd, which is getting close to where we are in our timeline, around this time 80 years ago, there was one night, 2nd, 3rd February, where they repulsed 3 separate banzai charges. And it was one platoon that was on the point of that. And they estimated that it was a company level banzai charge each time. So you're talking, nearly 100 men attacking a unit of, at this point, probably in the neighborhood of 50 to 60. And they repulsed it 3 times. And it was noted afterwards by the battalion commander that their fire discipline at that point was top notch. Some of the best he had seen. February 13th, so right after this weekend, 80 years ago, they considered it completed. Their mission up north was finished, and they were pulled out and sent as almost what we would call like a fire brigade to another point in the line, because the U.S. military, especially in the Pacific, was habitually low on numbers for riflemen. So anytime they could pull a unit out and put it somewhere else, they would do that. So by this time they estimated that they completed their combat in the north. And if you know anything about the terrain, Clark Field, which is outside of Manila, was a massive airfield that had been built up and everything, and the Japanese had used it as well. At this point, obviously, because of our air superiority, they had basically rendered it useless, but we still required its use for our air superiority. So in order for us to actually take it, you had to physically put guys on the ground. And one of the things they found was that if you look at the photo in the background, there was what's actually called Fort Stotzenberg. There was a ring of mountains behind it. And in order for them the American Army to utilize that airfield, they had to neutralize those defenses because they were able to directly fire on the airfield itself. Another thing you can see, which kind of brings it up, is a man attached to an engineering company, and we don't know which specifically because of the photo, but on his back is one of the pieces of equipment that the engineers started utilizing to attack bunkers, flamethrowers. I don't have one here today. That's a goal. Christmas, yeah. They are extremely effective for what they did. And the U.S. military and the 172nd noted that they were able to utilize a lot more man-portable heavy weapons in taking out these really tough positions.
Although by this time there was a huge fight going on in the United States between the Chemical Warfare Division of the Army and Congress and numerous humanitarian agencies about the use of flamethrowers, because everything that the Chemical Warfare Service had published about how flamethrowers actually kill people was not true. It was based on secondhand information, or early in the war, some major, fresh from the US, walked into this literally is one of the papers, somebody with no combat experience walked into one of the tunnels and saw Japanese soldiers dead with no burns on them, and assumed, oh, well, the flamethrowers must kill them by sucking all the oxygen out of the air and suffocating them. Yes, that can happen, but flamethrowers do a lot more than that. So there was, while they were finding that they were great weapons to use on the battlefield, I find it interesting, there was this huge fight back in the United States about whether or not to pull the flamethrowers out of service because they were just too barbaric. And the war ended before they came up with an answer, and the US had flamethrowers on inventory until the 1970s. And there were rumors about bringing them back in 2001 and 2002.
So during the fighting on Fort Stotzenberg, it was considered one of the tougher positions that the Japanese had put together. The reason for that is that even though the Japanese aircraft had been destroyed on the airfield, most of the crews, the ground crews, the mechanics, and armorers were able to pull off or even, cannibalize weapons off of these planes, 20 millimeter cannons, machine guns, things like that. And what they did was they brought them up into the hills and fortified their positions. In spite of that, the 172nd and the 43rd Division itself, when they were called in, it only took them 10 days to neutralize the area. After 10 days, they declared that all organized defenses had been destroyed. And there was one, I don't remember his name, I'm sorry, one of the other divisions wrote how when the 43rd specifically came in, they were extremely professional about how they did it and how they went through destroying these positions, even though the number of heavy weapons was way disproportionate to the number of Japanese defenders. From there, in March 13, approximately, is when the first unit started. They started attacking what's called the Shimbu Line. Shimbu Line is a line, again, mountains. The Japanese were notorious for pulling into really highly defensible positions. The Shimbu Line is just south of Clark Field and south of, I would say southeast of Manila. And the Shimbu Line had extreme terrain on the left flank, and then it kind of gradually lowered till you got to their right flank. What we would picture as the right flank. Of course, the 172nd was positioned again on the left flank. So we were now facing one of the toughest, one of the most heavily defended areas on Luzon, and we were hitting it in probably the toughest spot. And the fight at the Shimbu Line, which lasted several weeks, it was noted that the 172nd, when they were attacking these positions, actually got to a point where they were almost stalemated. And General Wing noted it, and the order came down that they were going to attempt a flanking maneuver. So they pulled one battalion out from the line, and they flanked it around behind these heavily defended positions to a point where the Japanese were not aware that they were getting to that position. Once they set up, the Japanese realized they were at this point in between two separate units, began to pull back. And you start seeing massive amounts of casualties for the Japanese because they had felt that their positions were extremely well defended, which they were. But at this point, they realized they were completely cut off and wanted to preserve as much force as possible. And as they were pulling back, they started to take some serious casualties. I'm going to go back. Yes. So one of the things you always read about and you always hear about, this actually, the photo I misplaced in where it actually is. One of the things you read about is that the Japanese never gave up, right? That's a universal thing you always hear about. In defense, the Japanese soldier never gave up. In the assault, the soldier will fight until he's dead. I find that really interesting. If you look at the lower left-hand picture, General Wing speaking with the Japanese soldier. Not only is he speaking with them, the Japanese soldier is pointing out his original position on a map. In the Shimbu Line, that incident took place on the Shimbu Line. Oops. And what that incident resulted in was the 172nd sent a battalion into this position. Over the course of 3 days, moved itself into a position where they were up on a ridge. And that soldier had pointed out his unit's position. They had very poor, what's the phrase, prisoner of war skills, training.
Yeah, it's actually rare at this point for any army to provide POW training to their troops. It was rare enough for the US military to do it. I think the British and Canadians probably did. You know, the whole thing you see in the movies, name, rank, and serial number. The Japanese, the Germans, the Italians, certainly the Russians, they never got any of that. Because, especially with the Japanese, where surrender was dishonor, they were never told, hey, if you're captured, don't give them any information. Instead, what we found with the Germans and especially the Italians and the Japanese was that when they were captured, they were perfectly willing to give up information because they didn't understand, they weren't trained on how that fit into the bigger strategic picture. Whereas the US, we were told, hey, name, rank, and serial number.
So that little incident where that Japanese soldier gave up, he was able to give the position. They pinpointed it on a map, and one of the battalions for the 172nd made its way into a position. And at the end of the day, by the time they'd gotten into position, they were able to eliminate a unit of about 350 Japanese soldiers. And they had no idea. They actually wrote afterwards, one of the letters home wrote how we had no idea that that cave was there. So that Japanese soldier gave up information. So it did happen and was not as common as I'm making it seem, but it did happen.
He might have been the Myrick of their unit.
So from the Shimbu line, they took it, they secured it. Then you have that horrible phrase, mopping up, which just meant that there were still forces there holding it, but they were not organized at this point. Their command structure had broken down. Still incredibly dangerous time for soldiers because now you have uncoordinated soldiers attacking you. From there, the 172nd was pulled out, the 43rd, and they were put into one of the toughest missions they were tasked with during World War II, which was taking the Ipoh Dam. So the Ipoh Dam provided about 30% of Manila's water, and the Japanese had shut it down. And at that point, the Americans found out that they were mining it. So they were preparing it for destruction. And they knew they needed, because there was already some horrific things, humanitarian crisis going on in Manila at the time. And they knew if the water completely shut off from the Ipoh Dam, that it would just become horrific. So we needed to take the dam. We needed to take the dam quickly enough that the Japanese weren't able to destroy it. And we also couldn't bomb it for multiple reasons. First of all, we didn't want to bomb the dam itself because one poorly placed bomb could have actually, ended that little escapade. The second thing was that unlike most of the other areas in Luzon, this had extremely heavy anti-aircraft fire support. So this whole region, you can kind of see on the map on the left-hand side. It's hard to get some reference, but it's a large area, and they had heavy anti-aircraft fire. So we weren't able to fly our little observation planes, little Piper Cubs.
Where's the dam on that?
On the map, the dam is right here. So our starting positions were about 5-6 miles away. What's really interesting about when I say starting positions is that we actually inserted almost two whole divisions into the area without the Japanese realizing it. So we had gone from the 172nd attached to these other units, had gone from a unit where they're holding hands at night because they're not trained on how to fight at night, to doing massive maneuvers under the guns of their opponents. And they got to a position of approximately 4 miles from where their objective was without the Japanese ever realizing it, which is good because it was heavily defended.
Now, earlier you said that it was the 172nd Battalion that was...
Or 172nd Regiment, Regimental Combat Team.
Right, because the 172nd was a battalion.
It was a full regiment.
So it was a company
It would have been 1 battalion out of 3. So yeah, they're I believe in that instance, I think it was the 3rd battalion. So it was 800-ish men, and of course that number varies and whatnot. So one of the biggest problems they had was that it was heavily defended. Like I said, the anti-aircraft, they weren't able to fly their Piper Cubs and everything, and it was relatively flat right up until the Japanese defenses. So one of the problems they were having is they needed to be able to, this is a battle that took place over the course of several days, and they needed to be able to evacuate their casualties, which they were taking heavy casualties. This is where it kind of comes in. It's a little interesting how this engagement was fought. They moved in at night, like I said, and in order to evacuate their casualties, they couldn't even do it at night normally because it was extremely dark and there was poor weather. So what Wing actually decided, one of the things he kind of requested, was the use of the 227th AAA Searchlight Battery. What does that mean? They were a unit that were equipped with extremely large searchlights, and their whole mission was to spotlight aircraft at night. Well, the Japanese had very few aircraft, if any, during the Battle of Luzon. So what he did was he utilized these massive spotlights, and I've been around them. They're incredibly powerful. And what he did is he kind of used the fact that they had low-hanging clouds and heavy weather, and he shone them up into the clouds itself, and it provided just enough light for the whole region that the Jeep drivers and the ambulance drivers were able to drive without any lights whatsoever. So the Japanese couldn't, it was just enough light that they could see it. Another thing that they utilized, which is very similar to what I'm standing in front of. This is one of the very first times that the US military used its very early type of helicopters. And these were used to evacuate troops.
To show you how difficult the searchlight thing was, this was done several times during the war. Most famously, it was done by the Soviets at the Zelo Heights outside of Berlin. They did the same thing with their searchlights, but what it ended up doing was silhouetting all of their troops as they stormed the German lines, and the Germans just mowed them all down. So being able to illuminate the terrain in such a way that the enemy can't see your ambulances and evacuations and things like that is really a skill.
So by the end of June, Ipoh Dam was captured, and by July 1st, they declared that all defenses and all Japanese troops defending had either been eliminated or captured. So one way or another, the Ipoh Dam was secured. They actually at one point sent out patrols, and they said that they couldn't find anybody for almost 10 miles. And that was everybody, because Japanese had kicked out everybody else. By the end of the war, 43rd had ranked at one of the units, one of the divisions in the Pacific that had made the most extreme turnaround. Starting its first engagement, where they suffered, of a campaign, they suffered 80% of the war neuroses cases. To by the end of the war, you have the commanding general of the army writing and extolling the virtues of the 43rd, and that being said, the 172nd. I'm not going to read off all the medals, but the 172nd did receive a Medal of Honor, which was extremely important to them. But what you also find is that the numerous engagements that these men took part in were extremely sharp. What they found is that, especially later in their career, they were found to be extremely professional soldiers. Throughout studying Vermonters at war and Vermonters in numerous wars, what you find is a consistent narrative, which is they may not be the most soldierly soldiers out there, but the Vermont troops in general are some of the toughest and hardest fighting soldiers. They will listen to commands. They'll usually follow them too. And they show that they truly are a tough breed. And I'm proud to live in the state, but something you do find is that, especially during World War II, they were some of the toughest troops that they had. You know, they rival some of these units that you read about in all the newsletters and whatnot. And the Winged Victory Division, 172nd being part of, was a huge part of that.
A lot of troops showed up like not tough and were toughened up by training. These guys showed up tough, and all they needed was the training to be able to put their toughness into effect. And so that's why, one of the reasons why their turnaround was so fast, because they showed up to training tough and ready to go with the right mindset.
We went a little long. Does anybody have any questions for us right now? Feel free. We're going to be here, obviously, till they kick us out. But does anybody have any questions for us in this environment?
You mentioned earlier that they suffered 4,000 casualties in that first engagement. That was of the 5,000 strength?
That was for the full division itself. So the whole division, I think, had, at that point on paper, roughly 16,000, 14,000, something like that. So they considered casualties even just taking someone out of the line for something medical and then bringing them back in. But so there was a large portion that were war neuroses. Yeah, and they, throughout the whole campaign, with the three divisions that were included, they suffered 80% of the war neuroses cases of that whole campaign.
There was another thing that took a lot of troops out of the line. The can openers on their jackknives, these are dangerous. They could get such bad cuts from the cans and from these can openers that it caused such a problem that the US military hijacked somebody's patent in 1944 for the safety can opener that we use now. But in the Pacific especially, where heat and everything getting into your wounds caused a lot of infections, these little can openers took a surprisingly high number of troops out of the line. That's often one of the reasons they got away from the metal cans and started putting everything in cardboard boxes.
True. Cardboard's easy. They're dummy proof. Anybody else have any questions? We're like I said, if you have any questions about the equipment or the clothing, we're more than willing to talk your ear off about that.
Did you have to see any how were the casualties in the Philippines as far as the percentage? Did you look at some of the numbers versus earlier in the war?
Yeah. So I had a number. So yes is the answer. They had my notes for some reason are a little funky on there, but they just simply by the fact that the campaign on Luzon was longer, the number of casualties were higher, but you do start to see lowering of relative casualties on Luzon because the training had you do see an effect of the training, and you do see that combined arms. One of the big problems of New Georgia versus Luzon is that when they talk about like combined arms, you're really unable to combine an infantry regiment with artillery, batteries and whatnot effectively because it is solid jungle. So by the time they hit Luzon, they were able to, the US Army at this point was much better in we'll call it like a running war, like a big war, versus what's going on in the jungles of these tiny little islands. So you do see the casualties go down, and you do see the treatment of the casualty, the effectiveness of the treatment go up. So.
Does the 43rd stay in the Philippines through the end of the war? Where do they go?
They do. So.
All right back to the United States from the Philippines?
So they do stay in the Philippines, and portions of it were actually part of the occupation force, thank you, of the occupation of Japan. So there's some really neat patches out there of the 43rd that are Japanese-made 43rd patches. And they're pretty unique. If you find any, I'll buy them off you. But yes, so they do stay there. A lot of the troops do come back. And I will bring up too, just kind of in line with that, one of the reasons that there's such great documentation on the 43rd and the 172nd is that at the end of the war, because there was, on average, there was a high turnover rate of officer, company level or battalion level officers that were either killed, wounded, transferred to other units. And so you have a large portion of, and of course it's across the board for most of these units, but you have a large portion of non-commissioned officers raised up to company level or platoon level command. At the end of the war, a lot of them were kept on and given the opportunity to complete their commission and stay in the military as an officer. And in order to do that, they had to attend, and we talked about it, Chris, I can't remember the name of the school.
It was the Infantry Officer Advanced Course, I believe.
Yes. So they had to take part in these officer training school, the officer training school. And one of the ironies, and you do read about guys writing home about this, where they said, I served 6 months as a company commander in combat. Why do I have to go to school to learn how to be a company commander? And so that being kind of the irony of it, but one of the aspects that they had to do to complete that school was they had to write some sort of essay or like a thesis on command. And I know a lot of them, I've read a lot of them that were, Grant at, Chancellorsville, or Colonel Chamberlain, at Little Bighorn, things like that, which are, well known, but they give a little, what did I say? Little Bighorn. No, yeah, he wasn't there. He was there in spirit. No, and so you see a lot of those, but a lot of these officers, current, the officers we're talking about, a lot of them wrote about their own experiences during World War II. So I actually have, if anybody wants to look through, I have these theses that they would write, and it would be about, how a platoon can defend in the jungle at night against armor. Well, that's a pretty specific example of command authority and how to command in combat. So these guys were writing about their own experiences. So we have some really, really good examples of the 172nd specifically during their involvements. Most histories weren't written immediately after. So the fact that we have these written maybe a year or two after, it's pretty unique, pretty cool.
That's one of the advantages of the National Guard. When I went in 30 years ago. Okay, when I went in 30 years ago, this year, on April Fool's Day, there were Vietnam vets in my unit. And we'd go out to the field. I was 6'2" and 120 pounds, so guess what they gave me? Just anybody. Throw it out there. Yes, I quote unquote humped the pig. So we'd go out to the field and I'd be with this guy, gray like I am now, and I'd do something, he says, don't do that. Okay. I'd do something else, he says, don't do that. Okay. He says, and by the way, when you change the barrel, don't pick your nose after you take that glove off. First of all, ew. Second of all, why? He says, the glove's made of asbestos. Great, okay, so no nose picking, avoid changing the barrel. And that happened, after World War II, we were thinking, okay, now we have the Soviets to fight, so we started gearing up for, preparation for a major war, but instead we had these little conflicts. And having experienced officers and NCOs from World War I, World War II, still in the National Guard, having that experience and that leadership formed a great cadre around which, active duty units would be built. And I gotta say that it was great being a young troop 30 years ago, out there in the field with Vietnam vets, just sharing all this information that you don't get in training manuals, you don't get in books. It's why I always carry 3 compasses and 2 knives. It's never come in handy, but I still do, because the Vietnam vet told me that. So, having this, it was good that they sent them to these unnecessary training schools, because now we have their thoughts on paper, and we've been basing how we do warfare to a certain extent off of all the experiences of these guys. And a lot of them they started they joined the National Guard as privates, fought their way up to sergeant, and then unfortunately got a battlefield commission, because that can be a pain in the butt. But they recorded their experiences, wrote everything down, and we have all these great resources that we can draw on. And they stayed in the National Guard and passed that information and that knowledge on.
If there are no more questions for this type of environment, feel free to come up, take a look at our toys. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Feel free, I have cards. If you have ideas, I should have asked this every time. If you have ideas for anything that you'd like to hear about, we probably have stuff for it, and way too much time on our hands in terms of wanting to tell people about it.